In this lesson, we're going to learn how to add entries into our access control list. To do this, we're going to work within the init.sql file, and we will be adding entries into our 4 ACL tables. Now, normally we would do this within our code whenever we insert a new user or we add a new domain object into our database. But we're just going to walk through this using SQL so that you can see the relationships between the different tables and learn how to build out an entry into your access control list. So the first table we'll be working with is the Acl Underscore Sid table, and this has 3 columns: an ID, a principal, and then a SID. So we'll insert values that will correspond with either principals or authorities. So let's enter our surrogate key of 1. Now we are going to be entering a user or a principal, so we will provide a Boolean value of true, and then we simply enter in the username of that principal. So in my example, here I'm using the KBauerSox auto user, and we can also enter in Joe Doe. So let's navigate back, we'll copy that entry, and we'll put Joe Doe within that table. And we're going to add 2 more entries, being sure to auto increment our keys each time. And our next entries for 3 and 4 are actually going to be different authorities. So we're going to set that second column to false, and then we will set the SID to role underscore user and role underscore admin. Those should look familiar to you. Now that we've finished up our work in the Acl underscore Sid table, we're going to look at the Acl underscore class table. And this is a very simple table. It accepts an ID, which is a surrogate, and then the second column is a class. And that class is a varchar, and it accepts a fully qualified class name. So we're going to be protecting our appointment entity. So I'm just going to navigate to the class, copy the package, and paste in the package name, and then put in the class name of appointment. So that means we're going to be using our ACL to protect appointments. Next, we need to enter in the entries for each appointment we want to protect. So you can kind of think of this as instances of an appointment that we're going to be protecting. So you can imagine this could get rather large when working in a system. We insert that into the Acl underscore object underscore identity table. And this also accepts a surrogate ID as well as an object underscore ID underscore identity. And this corresponds with the unique key that identifies your entity or your object. And in our case, it's going to be the appointment ID. Now, there's not a relationship that's actually created, but you would want them to be consistent. Next, you provide an object underscore ID underscore class, and that's just going to point to our ACL class table to say what type the object is. We also have a parent object in case there were some type of hierarchy established. In our case, there's not. We also provide the SID of the owner. And then we have an entries inheriting column, which we will not use. It's a Boolean, but we will not need to use that because we don't have any inheritance going on. So with that in place, we can start entering values. The first thing we will provide is our surrogate, which I'll just put in 1. Now we need to provide the appointment ID. So we see this first appointment has an ID of 1. And that is our object identity. Next, we provide the type, and we just need to provide this value of 1 that corresponds with the appointment because this object is of type appointment. For the parent object, we're just going to say it's null because there is none. For the owner SID, if we look at our appointment, you will see that it corresponds with our first auto user, and that is going to be KBauerSox. So we look up K Bowersox in the Acl Underscore Sid table, and we add the corresponding key of 1. Next, we're going to provide a value of false for the entries underscore inheriting. And that completes our ACL object identity entry. And we're just going to duplicate that to point to our second appointment instance. So we'll increment our surrogate, and we're going to say that our object identity is now 2. And then for the type, it remains at 1. We do not have a parent, so it remains null. And then for the owner SID, we specify the second SID, which corresponds with Joe Doe. Okay, so that completes our entries into the ACL underscore object underscore identity table. And finally, to complete our entry, we're going to insert into the ACL underscore entry table. And this table really combines all of our other information, such as our object identity, our SID, and then it defines the permissions. So let's walk through our columns here. First, we have the ACL object underscore identity column, and that's going to point to an object instance. Next, we have an ACE order, and that's used if there were multiple entries for a particular object. Then we have a SID. So here you can see what we're doing. We're tying an object to a person, and then we provide a mask. And this is a bit mask that defines permissions such as read or write. So there you can see really the gist of everything. What object are we protecting, for who, and what are the permissions on that object? And that really defines an ACL. Next, we have a granting column. We have an audit success column and an audit failure column. And those normally always default to true. So let's work through this. What object do we want to protect? Well, we want to protect our first appointment, which is specified in the ACL object identity table as having a key of 1. For the order, it's 1 because it's our first role. For the SID, we are going to provide these permissions to the K Bowersox user, who has an ID of 1 in the ACL SID table. Next, we're going to provide a mask, and we haven't talked about this much, but we're just going to enter 1, which will be read-only. And then for our remaining columns, we're just going to specify true for them. That's because they normally default to that. So let's duplicate this entry. And now we're going to provide an ACL entry for our second object. So we'll change that first value to a 2 to correspond with the second object instance. We can leave the order as 1. And we're going to enter these permissions for Joe Doe, who has an ID of 2 within the ACL underscore SID table. And then for the mask, we'll leave it at 1 read only. And then we have our columns defaulting to true. So there we have created our ACL. And using the 4 tables, we were able to identify an instance of an object or object identity. We identified our principals using the ACL underscore SID table. And then we combine those 2 objects along with a set of permissions in the ACL underscore object underscore identity table to really form our access control entry that makes up our ACL.